Hello, everyone. Hope you're doing well. Tonight I am going to be talking to you about cameras because I really like cameras and I have been casually shooting pictures on film for on and off for a good many years, so I don't know everything, but I hopefully know some things that you might not have thought about, or yeah. So hopefully you learned something. If you don't, that's okay. I am just glad you're here. So I will first show you my camera. This camera is a Canon. Get it to focus here. This is a Canon AE1 program. It is actually my dad's camera, but I use it because he doesn't. You can see that there are some fun little dials and buttons up on top here that I will explain in a minute. I'll take this lens cap off just so you can see what the lens looks like. I think it's a nice looking camera. Things that I would say about it are it does the job. I've never been disappointed with it. Never felt the need to upgrade to anything else. But if you're looking for something that's more advanced, it maybe doesn't have all of the bells and whistles that you might find on nicer cameras. But for me it does the job, and I'm very happy with it. I want to explain a bit about the technical side of shooting on film and just shooting pictures in general. Digital modern cameras have gotten very good at deciding what the best settings are automatically for a given scene. So we most of the time don't really need to think about things like aperture or shutter speed or things like that because the camera is doing it for us. But for me, I like to know about this kind of stuff. It makes me feel more creative and in control of the process. And I just like knowing things and knowing how to use them correctly. So for me it's fun. And just the film process specifically in general is kind of freeing as a creative process. Some may find it annoying that they have to wait for the film to be processed and developed and sent back to them. But I think that the waiting is quite enjoyable and adds a bit of suspense and mystery to the process. So I quite like it, but I know that it's not for everyone. But if it's for you, maybe you'll get something out of this. So, what should we talk about first? Well, I'm going to put up a diagram on screen that I want to explain a bit about right now. This is the exposure triangle. It basically gives you an idea of what the three main aspects of your camera will do to the image when it's exposed. Those three things being shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. If you don't know already, I will give you a brief explanation of what they each are. Shutter speed is how long your shutter is open and exposing the film, or whatever sensor you have if you have a digital camera. ISO is the sensitivity of your film or sensor. And lastly, aperture is the size of the hole that your lens allows light through. So, how do these affect our image? Well, let's start with shutter speed because I think it's the most easy to understand. Shutter speed, it's probably fairly obvious that if you leave the door open to the film for a longer amount of time, the more light will be able to enter and expose the film, so it will be brighter. All three of these things have side effects, you could say, that also change how the image looks at the end. Shutter speed's side effect is motion blur. If you have a very long shutter speed where the shutter is open for maybe longer than 1/60th of a second, you will start to notice that motion is blurring across the image. So for example, if someone is running across the screen and you have an image that is exposed at a shutter speed of longer than 1/60th of a second, you will notice that the person who is running will be blurred. And it's not because you haven't missed or haven't focused correctly or anything like that. It's just that the light that they are producing for your film is moving over the amount of time that you have exposed it, so it will be blurry. The other thing that we should talk about is ISO. ISO, which can also be called ASA, they are exactly the same thing, is just a measure of how sensitive the film is. And as you can see, the side effect on ISO is that the higher it is, the more grain will be introduced. I should also say that the higher the ISO, the brighter your image will be. Film grain is something that some people like, but very often is not very well liked. I personally think it's okay in moderation, but if it's too excessive, it does become distracting to the image. But it's mostly preference. The last thing that is, I would say, one of the more confusing things is aperture, which we said was the size of the hole that the lens lets light through when it exposes. This isn't very complicated of a subject, but the side effect that it introduces is relatively, I would say you probably have seen, you would recognize it if you saw it. You have seen the effect before, but it's maybe a little bit difficult to explain, but I will try my best. I don't know if I mentioned already, but it is called depth of field. When you are focusing on a subject, you are deciding how far away you want the area to be that is in focus. So if I am shooting a friend of mine who is 5 feet away, I will focus so that 5 feet away from me is in focus. Depth of field refers to the distance from that focusing point that an object can be from it and still be in focus. So if I have a shallow depth of field, meaning that that area of focus is very small, maybe a few inches away from the focusing point would be in focus, but any farther away it would be blurry. And this is not a hard change, but rather a gradual change from in focus to blurry. Likewise, the deeper depth of field would be one where basically everything is in focus in the image, no matter how far away from the focusing point it is. And you can see through this diagram that the wider your aperture, the larger the hole is in the lens. Actually, the more shallow the depth of field is. So you will want to keep that in mind when you are composing an image, to make sure that the things that you want to be in focus are actually going to be in focus. The other thing that this introduces is the idea of stops of light. A stop is merely a relative measurement of an amount of light. So, and it goes by doubling or halving. So, if you have a certain amount of light and you raise it by one stop of light, that is doubling the amount of light. The other way, if you have one stop less, then that is dividing in half the amount of light. On the diagram you can see that the shutter speed is measured here in stops of light. 1/15th, 1/30th, 1/60th, 1/125th of a second. Those are all stops of light. With ISO, you can see that it starts at 100, which is relatively low ISO, and doubles from there. So these two are pretty easy to get a hang of how much light you will be adding and reducing. With aperture, it is a little bit different because the stops of light are actually in multiples of 1.4. So it's more difficult to calculate this kind of thing, and you are probably just better off memorizing the numbers. You can see here 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16. I'm not sure why they included 1.8 in this diagram. I think that's a little bit misleading because that is not one stop of light away from 1.4. However, I think the rest of the diagram is laid out well enough that we can overlook that error. It's not really an error because I think they're just trying to get you familiar with what kind of apertures are available for cameras, and that sometimes cameras might even have half stops. So because one stop is just a unit of measurement, sometimes cameras will have half stop increments, like this 1.8. But just remember for yourself that that is not one stop away from 1.4. Hopefully this all makes sense. I know it's kind of a lot to take in if you haven't delved into this before, but I would say the most important things to know are that the longer your shutter speed, the more light you'll be able to let in, but if it goes too long, you may start dealing with motion blur. And this can also, I would like to say, even happen if there's nothing happening necessarily in your shot. Just the fact of not having a tripod can make your whole image look blurry because of the micro movements of your hand while you are taking and pressing down on the shutter. So I would say if you are doing anything that needs a longer shutter speed, anything longer than around 1/60th of a second, I would strongly urge you to use a tripod because your images will turn out much, much sharper than if you weren't using one. For tripods, just make sure that they have good reviews. There's a lot of brands that make them. I would say try to spend close to $100, but if you can't do that, honestly, if it holds your camera well, it's probably fine. So, yeah. I would just say that a bad tripod is very annoying to use. So, just try to get one that people like. Okay. Yeah. And then ISO, the higher the ISO, the brighter, the more sensitive your film is going to be. But it can introduce grain if it gets too high. Say above 800, I think, or above 400, I think you'll start to notice it quite drastically. Digital is very good at raising the ISO without adding too much grain, but on film, I would say anything above 400 is starting to get pretty grainy. And then aperture. The wider it is, the more light that's going to come in, and thus the brighter your image is going to be. But you may not get everything in focus that you want to if your subject is fairly large. I want to show you some images that I took to give you some examples of the concepts that we've been talking about. First one I want to talk about is the shutter speed. In this first image, you can see that it's pretty blurry. You might think that I have not focused correctly, but what's actually going on here is that I didn't have a tripod, and it was pretty dark. So I think I had my aperture probably fairly wide open, but I still had to have a shutter speed that was relatively long to get the correct exposure. And so as you can see, it is quite blurry because I was not able to keep my hand still. So yeah, this image suffered quite a lot. The most important thing I could have done was just use a tripod. But I didn't have one at the time, so this is the image I got. So it doesn't always have to be bad, though. Motion blur can be used creatively, and with this image here, I wanted to just create some energy. This was actually taken by a friend of mine, and that's me headbanging, playing a little toy keyboard. And I think it was a cool shot. I think we also didn't have a tripod in this scenario. As you can see, I'm quite amateur. But I think it's a cool shot and it works. This next image is an example of depth of field, the way that aperture affects depth of field. So in this image, you can see that some of the berries and leaves are pretty good in focus, and then even some of the other berries are actually out of focus, and the background is completely blurred out of existence. I think I probably had my my aperture as wide open as possible, probably 1.4, and then adjusted my shutter speed to compensate for that, so it would have been pretty fast. I remember taking this, and the leaves blowing in the wind were quite difficult to manage. I basically just had to guess when I thought that the parts of the plant that I wanted to be in focus would be in focus, and just pray. And I think this image, it turned out pretty good. I like it. This next image is an example of the opposite, where my aperture is set very high, meaning that the light being let in was very low, and the amount of that depth of field effect was basically non-existent. I wanted everything to be in focus in this image, as there were some things up close, cars and buildings and trees, and then you can actually see Alcatraz in the back. Um, yeah, so because this was a sunny day, I was able to set my aperture very high and still maintain a fairly fast shutter speed. If this was at a time of day where there wasn't as much light, I would not have been able to get this kind of shot because my aperture would have been wider by necessity. This image is another one that is a good example of depth of field, and it also showcases the film grain effect that you can get at really any ISO, but I think this one was probably 400 as well. And if I zoom in, you can see quite clearly that there is this grain texture happening. It's not very bad in this image. I think it looks fine, especially if you are not very close up to the image. But you can see that as this effect becomes more noticeable, the image suffers. So yeah, just wanted to give you an example of what that looked like. Let's talk about my camera again. Alright. So, in this camera, we have our aperture settings right here. And you can see that they are 1.4, 2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22. And the ring allows you to select apertures that are in between those numbers, so you're not tied to those specific numbers. This is our focusing ring. It tells you how many feet away your subject needs to be in focus. Or rather, it will tell you what distance will be the center of focusing. I don't know if you can tell, but you can also see that in between the aperture ring and the focusing ring, there is these numbers in between, which is a guide for depth of field. So let me take a look at this. What it's telling you is that so basically there's numbers here, there's a line, and then there's numbers on either side. 4, 8, 11, 16, and 22. So those are our aperture measurements. And what that's saying is, say I'm focused 10 feet away. If I am on f4, that's how you say what aperture setting you're on. It is, right now I'm on f4. So since I'm on f4, you can see that there are 2 4s on either side of that line, and that is indicating above how far from the focusing point I can be, or sorry, how far away from the focusing point will still be in focus. So it's fairly close to, as you can see, that line, f4. So the depth of field is going to be fairly shallow. If I were to move this so that it is at f22, you can see, hopefully, that this number over here, 22, is saying that even though we are focusing at 10 feet, you can be farther than 30 feet, or sorry, 30 feet away from you when you're taking the picture will also be in focus. And also over here, this 22 is saying that almost 5 feet away from you will also be in focus. And I think that if this number is beyond this 30 number, then it'll just go into infinity. So basically 22 is saying that if you're focusing on your subject, everything else in the shot is going to be in focus as well. Sorry, that's really hard to see. I don't know if you can see that very well. Okay. What else do we have here? Well, let's talk about shutter speed. So, right here, this is our shutter speed dial. I can just spin it. And you'll see numbers like 1,000, 500, 250, 125, and lower. And what that is telling you is the denominator of the fraction of second that it is. So this is saying 1/1000th of a second, 1/500th of a second, 1/60 of a second, 1/4 a second, 1/2 a second. The 1 means 1 second. The 2, this kind of orange 2, means 2 seconds. And then this B right here refers to bulb, which means that the shutter will stay open as long as I am holding the shutter button down, which I will say is right here. What else do we have? This right here is our film advancer. There's no film in there right now, so it's okay. That was very loud. I'm going to make that quieter after this. What else do we have? This is the film winder. So when you're done, you can pop this open, give it a wind. Actually, I was going the wrong way, but yeah. Oh, the other thing is these little green numbers right here. That is our ISO or ASA selector. Like I said, they're both the same thing, so it doesn't matter. You can say either and it will mean exactly what you want it to mean. And to change that, we hold down this little button and then slide it like so. The important thing to know about this is that when you're changing that, you are not changing the ISO of the film. That is set. What you are doing is telling the camera what ISO your film is so that it can meter the light correctly. This camera and many other cameras have a digital light meter built in so that you don't have to use one externally. So based on your shutter speed, whatever your shutter speed is set at, it will tell you what aperture you need to set to get the correct exposure. And that's done by half pressing the shutter button. So let's just do a test right now. I am going to set my shutter speed to 1/60th of a second, and I am going to point it at you and focus just for funsies, and then I am going to half press, and it tells me that I need to set my aperture at f4. So I will set it to f4, and I will take the picture. But what if, like we talked about before, we know that f4 has a depth of field that is very shallow. What if I don't want that? What if I want f11 or something like that? Here's where the stops of light get useful. So I can see, because my camera has them arranged this way, that f11 is 3 stops away from f4. Okay, so what I can do is I can set my aperture to f11, and then what do I need to do to compensate for that? Because it's told us that f4 is the correct aperture we need to expose the scene correctly. Well, since I have moved the aperture by 3 stops of light, and because it is going to be a smaller hole, meaning it will be darker, so 3 stops less light, I need to make the shutter speed longer by 3 stops. So if I had it at 60 before, I need to go to 30, 15, 8, 1/8 of a second. Now that's pretty long. So if I don't have a tripod to take this image with, I should basically either think of a different way to take the picture or something, because it's not going to be clear if I take it at 1/8 of a second without a tripod. It's just not going to happen. We're not robots. We can't hold our hands that steady. So in this case, I would think about whether I really needed it to be at f11. And then if I really do need it at f11, I would just have to think of another way to compensate for it, because yeah, it just wouldn't happen if I didn't have a tripod. So, what else about this camera? I think I can show you how to, or at least where to load the film. And then maybe we can talk a little bit about film in general. So, to load the film, you actually pop the winder up, and then I'm going to make sure this doesn't make a loud noise. You pull it up, and then click once more, and the film area will open up, and you can see that you put the film in here, pull out the film to the other side, thread it on this side, and then advance the film a couple times until it seems like it's solid, maybe once or twice. I think twice usually does it. And then close it up again. Alright, let's talk a little bit about film. Who doesn't like talking about film? That's what I want to know. Okay, this is, got it upside down. This is a film roll that I shot recently, finished shooting. This is Portra 400 Kodak. So, and you can see that there are 36 exposures, which I have taken all of. 400 is, maybe you might be able to figure this out, is the ISO. So it has a set ISO 400, and that does not change in any way. This is color negative film. You can see right there, color negative film. That means that all of the colors that it exposes to are the opposite of what they should be. So when they are developing it, they have to do the reverse process. I honestly do not know very much about developing, so I can't give you a whole lot of insight there. But color negative is not the only type of film. There is slide film, which I think is also called transparency. Basically, it's the same as film, but or rather, it is similar to color negative film in that it's transparent, but the colors are accurate to what they should be. This is a box of Portra 800 that I have not used yet. And it also says 135. That is referring to 35 millimeter, which is the size of film that it is. So if you see 135, don't freak out, it just means 35 millimeter. what else can we say? I think 36 exposures is fairly standard. I think they can also have 24, maybe. But I think 36 is fairly common. Here's another thing I can show you. This is another Canon lens that I have. It is a zoom lens. I got it on pretty recently on KEH.com. It's like a used camera gear site. They have a lot of old film gear type products. This one honestly looks relatively new, even though it's not. This is a discontinued mounting type, which I will show you here. Looks like this. That is an FD Canon mount. And you can see that this is a telephoto lens, so I can extend it and it will optically zoom in on whatever I'm looking at. Oh, this is a good time to talk about focal length. You can see that this says 75 to 200 millimeter. So many numbers. What this means is that its focal length is 75 to 200 millimeters. So what is focal length? Technically, focal length is the distance from the... Okay, let's start from the beginning, whatever the beginning is. When light enters a lens, it is, because the lens is convex, the light will be bent inward. So there is a point in the lens where the light converges. So that convergence point is measured to the film. So the distance between the convergence point of the light in the lens to the film is measured in millimeters, and that is the focal length. So what does that mean for the image? Well, I don't fully understand how it works, but I know that a smaller number for focal length means that the image will appear wider. Okay, so this lens that's on the camera is a 50 millimeter lens. So that is even wider than the widest that this lens can go, because this is 70 to 200 millimeters. And you can also see when I pull this out that it has the depth of field guide as well, and it actually adjusts for however zoomed in you are, or more technically what focal length you have. So this is the guide here. This is my focusing ring. This is my aperture down at the bottom. Oh, I was pressing the wrong one. Okay. A couple of cool things about this lens, other than that it can zoom in and out, is that it has this button right here. What is that? So if I click that, if I press it in, and then twist. Oh, I think it might have to be on the camera for it to work. Let me see. Oh no, I'm just doing it wrong. Yeah. So if it's here, all the way to the largest aperture setting, the largest f-stop, and you press this A and spin it even farther, it'll click into place, and that means that the aperture will be set automatically based on the light in the scene, which is pretty cool. I have never used it, and I never will, because I don't really like using automatic kind of stuff. It's just not really something that I care about. I think it's on these kinds of lenses and cameras because film used to be all that people had. So if you wanted a camera, but you didn't really want to know all the technical stuff, you could just set it on auto or program, and just let it do its thing. So, for example, with this camera, you can see a big program mode, which I can set like this. It's now in program mode, and it will just do everything for me. It'll decide the aperture, it'll decide the shutter speed. I believe that's how it works. It will not focus because it will always be manual focus, but yeah, I can see it being useful for somebody who just wants to get the look of film, but doesn't really want to think about all of the nitty-gritty. But I would never use it, and I don't think that most people using film today have any interest in using automatic stuff, so I would urge you to not use it ever. What was I going to say? Oh, the other cool thing about this lens is that it has a macro setting, which if you're all the way zoomed out, if you click that button and then turn it, I think, turn it to the right, it becomes an extra focusing ring so that you can get macro shots, which means like very close-up shots. So this is now like a macro focusing ring. Very, very cool. By the way, this was $50 on KEH for a basically new Canon lens. So I would highly suggest checking out that website if you have the desire to get into film, or you have a camera and maybe you don't have the lens you want for it, or just anything. They have it all there. So, one other thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the idea about lower light image taking, and how it can be a little bit problematic if you don't, especially if you don't have a tripod. But if you do have a tripod, you can actually take images in relatively little to almost no light, if you know how to do it correctly. One thing that you will need is this. This is a light meter, and you can see there's a sensor here. That is what your light meter will be using to determine how much light is in your scene. And if I turn it on here, you can see that some numbers come up. And it is set to this F, which is aperture priority. So that means that I am telling it what aperture I want. And then this number is telling me how long my shutter speed should be to correctly expose the scene. So let's try this out. Say that I want my aperture to be 8. All I have to do is point it at my subject, click the button, and it'll tell me 4. That is 1/4 of a second. It's relatively dark in here. I have basically just one light going. So even at f8, which is somewhere in the middle, it still needs a full 1/4 second to expose correctly. Say we wanted to take an image of a scene that had even less light. Say if it was at night and you wanted to take maybe an image of a building or something, you can use this to determine how much time you'll need to expose it to get the correct exposure. But there is actually a extra step that you need if you're going to be exposing for longer than about 2 seconds, because the way that film works is that the sensitivity of the film actually degrades over time during the exposure. Under about 2 seconds, it doesn't really matter because the degradation is not significant enough to affect how you're calculating things. But over 2 seconds, it starts to degrade more and more, that sensitivity to light, and you have to compensate for that. So that is called reciprocity failure. I'm going to throw a diagram up on screen to show you what I mean. So you can see here that there are some different film types on the right, and there's numbers to the right of the films. So for me, I have this K400, Kodak 400, and this has a number next to it of 1.3. So what does that mean? Well, to get the actual correct exposure time or shutter speed that we need, we actually need to raise the measured time by the power of that number. So, if for example we had a shot that needed, that our light meter was saying needed a 4-second exposure, all we do is open up our calculator. I have a calculator right here. And we are going to put in the amount of seconds that it said that we should expose for. So say if it told us we need to expose for 4 seconds, we'll put that in. And then we need to raise it to the power of 1.3. The reason that there's different numbers for different films is that they degrade at different rates over time. So each film will have a different number that needs to be raised to. But ours, if you're using Portra 400, is 1.3. So we will do 4, and then raise to the power of, which is that XY button right there, raise to the power of 1.3 equals 6, and so on. So when it tells us that we need to expose for 4 seconds, we actually need to expose for 6. And because of the way that it degrades over time, the film degrades over time, the longer that it tells you you need to expose for, the greater the difference between the measured time and the actual time that you need to expose for. So let's say that my meter says that I need to expose for 8 seconds. So I put in 8 raised to the power of 1.3. That equals almost 15. So if we had only exposed for 8 seconds, it would be pretty drastically underexposed, since we needed to actually do it for 15. This is a really cool way of getting some cool shots that are maybe a little bit unexpected, as things can look a little bit different at night. One other thing that you will need for that is this. This is a shutter release cable. I'll show you how it works. Along with your tripod, you will need this to make sure that you're not bumping your camera while you're taking the image, because since it's a long exposure, it'll be pretty sensitive to that. So this has a little screw-like end, and you'll see that the shutter release, or the shutter button, actually has a little threaded hole in it. So all we have to do is thread. I'm trying to do this while showing you as well. We just thread it. Oh, come on, focus, please. It's having a hard time. It's trying to focus on my hand. You just thread it into that hole, and now this is my shutter release. So now there is no setting on this shutter speed dial, excuse me, dial that is 15 seconds long, or longer than 2 seconds. So I'll remind you of the bulb setting. Let's set it to that. So set it to bulb, and then this will stay open for as long as you're holding down this button. Okay? Let's try it out. First we advance the film, and then say we have 8 seconds. Okay, obviously I would use a timer if I was actually doing it, but that's how you do it. It's very easy. This costs like $5. Just do it. It's easy. I think that might conclude everything that I wanted to say. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you. Hopefully you found this enjoyable or enlightening or life-changing, maybe. If not, that's okay. I'll see you later.